All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Just a super quick introductions of those of us who are here. My name is Ryan Perlongo. I work for the DCJS. Actually, all of my colleagues here work for the DCJS, just in different capacities. My job is to work for what's called the evidence-based training and innovation side of the house. And Brian DeSalvo, to my left, and Scott Phillips, Dr. Scott Phillips, to my left there, are both field advisors in the field operations side of our work, who basically the goal of this, one of the many goals of this presentation, is to lend multiple perspectives on the idea of a crime harm index. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it from my perspective and a little bit on the sort of implementation side of things. You know, Brian is going to serve largely and fundamentally as a contextualizer, as a very recently retired practitioner. And Dr. Scott is going to talk a lot about the actual statistical logistics, as well as the evidence that supports something like this. So just to give you an idea of who everybody is real quick, and get the show on the road. We are also going to make a concerted effort to not take the entire hour, because we do acknowledge that we are the final session of the day, and we'll do our best to get everything done as quick as we can, but with the information that we think you guys will benefit from. So with that being said, let me talk a little bit about the idea of a crime harm index. So basically what we're trying to do here is talk about, I would argue, two or three fundamental things. The first thing is that as we get more and more entrenched in evidence-based policing, the goal is to optimize the work. And over the course of the gun-involved violence elimination program, GIVE, that we all serve, and the statewide initiative that is funding multiple sites across the state to drive down gun violence. Over the course of that time, we've enhanced a lot of the work we've done in evidence-based policing as the evidence has improved. And one of the places where that has gotten more and more precise and streamlined is in the area of hotspots policing. So in terms of hotspots policing, there used to be lots of blob maps and saturation maps and large zones that served as like primary concentration points. And as time has gone on, we've gone from larger concentrations to more focused concentrations to micro hotspots to very key indicators for both the places and the specific trigger puller and drivers of violent crime. And so what we are trying to do with the crime harm index here, or this discussion, is talk about a slightly different perspective and lens in which you can look at taking another vantage point at hotspots policing and perhaps being even more precise or providing a different kind of look at what's happening in a geographical region. So the next thing I really want to talk about is why it matters. So why it matters is fundamentally every police department has to do, as time goes on and everyone continues to have more responsibilities with either the same amount of staffing or perhaps even less, they want to be able to get the most bang for their buck for what they're doing with their people, how those people are behaving, and exactly where they're going to focus their efforts. And so one of the ways in which the crime harm index can benefit you is that it optimizes where you can focus those resources, and it provides a unique why that perhaps traditional hotspots policing does not. So another thing that's important here is sometimes when people talk about mapping or harm mapping or any hotspot mapping, they think maybe this is only a large organization thing. In the case of the crime harm index, that is not the case. There are lots of different ways in which you can create maps that indicate where harm is occurring in a jurisdiction. And we obviously sort of later after this, if you have more questions about how that could be done or leveraged specifically to an agency size or an agency problem, we can talk about that. But suffice to say that there are lots of opportunities for using this regardless of the size or the amount of, say, shootings or homicides you may happen to have in your jurisdiction. So one last caveat that we have to throw out there. We're going to walk you through what the crime harm index is and how it's utilized or how we've utilized it. But there is plenty of nuance to this, and there's plenty of this that is subject to debate. debate we are totally open to having with anyone in this room about what makes the most sense. As a matter of fact, the key goal to this and everyone else we've ever provided this to is to provide as many different vantage points as possible to contextualize this work. So it's important for you to not only just take a look and listen and see what you think, but to provide us with that feedback, because the more we know and the more personal information that you can provide about the utilization of anything that gets provided to you as a potential product is beneficial to us to streamline it in a way that makes the most sense for people who are using it. So.
Right, I want to take a moment. Can you hear me with this? Is it okay back there? Right, the idea of the harm index is that not all crime is equal, and we kind of obviously understand that inherently. There's a difference between a murder and a shots fired type of call, or a theft or something like that. Now, the idea here is that all crime can be counted, and that's what police agencies have been doing for forever. They count the number of crimes that are occurring, calls for service, reports that are written, these kinds of things. But not all calls for service are crimes, first of all, because we can have calls for service for a variety of things that, like, could be barking dogs or something like that. That's not really crime specifically. You couldn't prosecute anybody for it. And there's also the idea that some crimes are going to be inherently more harmful at the gut level. And we're going to be talking about the difference between subjective and objective as well. But at the gut level, there's going to be some that just feel different. And that's one of the ideas of the harm index, is to don't just count the number of crimes that are occurring in a location. How much harm is coming from the things that are occurring there?
Okay. Yeah. So when it comes to this, one of the biggest problems when it comes to counting any kinds of crime is that it can misrepresent exactly the kind of effect you're having both on driving down crime and also driving down what I think anyone in this room would argue is your key goal, right? Your key goal is to drive down the worst kinds of crime, to drive down victimization, and to help the people who are calling in need of service, right? So the kinds of calls that are coming from the community to the police, and you are answering those calls. You want to drive down victimization first, and you want to drive down the worst harms the most. And so what the crime harm index tries to do is essentially assign a value to those things so that you can be in a position to identify exactly where that harm is occurring, because the frequency of that harm may not be represented in a map that is only taking a look at how many times a thing is happening versus how severe that is to a particular community. And Scott will break down exactly what that looks like a little bit later, but there's this whole idea of high volume and low seriousness that can really bog down a map and make you think that maybe you should be focusing your efforts in area A, but area B is actually the place where there is actually more harm occurring to a community. So one of the things I want to mention when it comes to this is the idea of objectivity as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on in this presentation as well. But one of the goals of the Crime Harm Index is to create something that the community can get behind. Because the goal of a Crime Harm Index is to assign not a person's opinion or a subjective value or some random 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 binary number to a crime that occurs, but to attach an agreed upon, an objective, and a essentially statutory, statewide, uniform number to what is actually occurring and what kind of victimization is happening, so that it's quite objective in its goal. So, good Lord. I'm having fun today. So with that, I'll let Scott kind of break down what that looks like.
Okay, so the total counts of crime include crimes that are detected solely or mostly by proactive policing. The example I use, and bear with me on this one, is a DWI. A man could be driving home, drunk, make it home, never hurt anybody, and pull into the driveway, and some people would say, well, it's still a crime, but the others would say, well, it wasn't counted. No harm, no foul. So the idea here is that if a cop is involved in initiating the event, so you got the drunk driver and the cop sees the person, the idea is that it's probably not a good idea, because what we're trying to get at is harm towards society. And again, this is part of the debate that that Ryan mentioned a few moments ago. We can debate whether to include these or not. Our suggestion, my idea, is not unique. It's founded on some of the research. Is don't include when an officer initiates the activity. That can be somewhat artificial in the sense of it can drive down or drive up crime. If a police officer is very active, very busy, that's going to drive crime up because of what the officer is doing. If an agency is short officers, there are much fewer officers, they're not going to be conducting as many traffic stops or any of those self-initiated activities. That would indicate crime going down because they're not doing as much. So that's an artificial inflation or deflation of what counts are going on.
Scott, could I just add something there? I think when it comes to that, too, another way to think about it is if an officer stops somebody on a traffic stop and they recover a firearm during the stop, it's a higher felony charge, and it's going to kind of naturally inflate the statistics of that area. Like if you're looking at hotspots policing, you may count that CPW charge as part of that area, but it was probably just a random area where the officer just happened to stop that car and make that arrest. So that's just a different way to look at it, that those crimes really can't be counted because of the randomness of where it occurred. So what we're going to be talking about is trying to exclude that. And there's actually different ways that you might be able to take a look at proactive work as a harm index. We're not going to really get into that, but we're talking about trying to exclude that. So you're seeing really where the harm occurs. Another thing that I think a lot of people can relate to is calls for service data. Some people will take a look at that, or some agencies will take a look at calls for service data, and they'll say, okay, well, we drove down calls for service, so we're being more successful in this area because calls for service are going down. Well, we also know, too, if officers are more proactive in this area, what does that tend to do possibly for calls for service? It inflates it, right? Because they're creating their own job cards, so thus inflating the amount of calls for service. So if you're looking just at calls for service, it might be a problem. So it's just a different way to look at it.
Right, and this is what I was mentioning a moment ago. When you have limited police resources, they're not going to be doing as much. They'll be going to the calls that are coming in, and they're going to have to take breaks in between them because they're so busy, so it might artificially deflate the amount of crime that is occurring. Okay, so we're going to trade places here. This is not intended to be a trick question, but then again, maybe it is. So the idea is here is which is less harmful. Now, I bring up reckless endangerment first degree because I work in Niagara County, Erie County, so I work closely with Niagara Falls. And Niagara Falls, whenever there's a shots fired call, and the officers would show up to the call because somebody's calling it in. They show up, they find some shells on the ground, they document it as shots fired, reckless endangerment because nobody's actually shot with the gun. It could have been popping in the air, they could have been shooting at somebody and missing. So we've got, these are my little stick figure characters because this is the best I can do. I'm not a 15-year-old boy. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We got 10. We got 10 reckless endangerment charges that are documented in an area of Niagara Falls. Next to that is a murder, which is this guy here who's dead. Which is less harmful? Gut level, which is less harmful? I don't usually ask questions because I know a room full of police officers, they never talk. The murder's worse. The murder's less harmful. The individual's dead is more harmful. Okay, I don't know. It depends. You're not a student in this classroom. You got to pick a side.
You can't force a choice. It totally depends. If that guy was out shooting up the town and he's murdered, that might be a net positive.
Just leave it alone. It's just a guy who's dead.
To invest in the neighborhood because of reckless endangerment, then that's a long-standing problem.
Keep doing this.
I also think it depends on all those reckless endangerments on different days. The volume of the reckless endangerment make it more of a heightened.
All right, I'm going to pull out the Texas in me. Y'all are going way too deep on this. Way too deep. Murder's the worst. The point here is what we'll be getting at is that the charge that is applied to the crime that occurs comes with a certain amount of penalty, a certain amount of punishment. And the reckless endangerments, knowing zero, no other information, if a person were arrested and charged with this, this would be a D felony in the state of New York. defelony in the state of New York, knowing nothing else, is 2 years. 2 years is 730 days. The murder second is 20 years. So if you had 10 shots fired in one area, and they were all caused by one person, and you charged them all, and again, knowing nothing else, that is 7,300 days of punishment. Bear with me on this one. The exact same amount when you get a 20-year sentence over here. 10 times 2 is 20, 1 times 20 is 20. These are identical when it comes to harm based upon New York State punishment. That's all we're doing here is basing it upon it. That's a completely cold-hearted, objective approach to how to do this. So when we look at crime as harm, rather than just counting crimes, you're going to classify, this is what our suggestion is for a crime harm index, classify each crime type according to how harmful it is relative to all the other crimes that might be going on around it. So it's got to be an objective measure, can't be opinion. Now we all appreciate the fact that the guy on the right-hand side is dead. The incidents on the left-hand side were all shots fired where nobody was injured. Viscerally, at a gut level, we feel the murder is more harmful. But with a harm index, you're trying to go after something that's more objective than that. And so, according to some information in the research by Larry Sherman, who will be here tomorrow, I really wish he were here right now, is that there's a three-pronged approach to developing a crime harm index to make it as objective and fair as possible. The first, what he calls the democracy test. Just make it fair, based upon the will of the people. Now, we can go out there and survey thousands of people and ask them what the standards are. But the idea here is that if you use with the approach we're suggesting, people would all say, yeah, that's fair. They might not like it, but they would appreciate how the math is being done. The second is its reliability. It's got to be consistent. So a murder in Niagara Falls is the same as a murder in Plattsburgh, or a murder in Albany, or a murder in New York. They're all the same when it comes to a second-degree murder charge. And again, if nobody's arrested, knowing no other information. The last, relatively inexpensive, and this is important for police agencies who want to do this, because this is what we're trying to promote, is that it doesn't take a lot of effort and expense to do this. The suggestion is that you rely on the New York State legislation. The minimum sentencing standards is what's been suggested. This gets a little touchy down the line, and we'll see this in a couple of minutes. But again, the idea here is that shots fired, murder, we understand what it is. The state legislative branch of the government has said, okay, if somebody is murdered, it's worth 20 years in prison knowing nothing else. So we appreciate that idea that it's also easy to do and it's inexpensive. So when it comes to minimum sentencing, these are the starting points that we used for this demonstration. Other people can go in different directions, but that's the point. This is an exercise we're trying to show to you. Again, why the minimum? If nobody's arrested, there is still harm to society. This was the debate I mentioned earlier with the drunk driver who actually drives home but doesn't hurt anybody, doesn't kill anybody, parks the car, goes in the house. Nobody's been hurt here. What we're looking at is there still harm to society with that drunk driver? And that's the debate. Clearly, shots fired is scaring the hell out of people. Somebody dead, there's injury extensively in that area. So there's harm to society when we're talking about the kinds of crimes you would want to include. Even if there is an arrest. And again, as things get charged, as people debate, as plea bargains are made, there may be extenuating circumstances, maybe aggravating or mitigating factors. We're trying to avoid that because that gets into the issue of who's getting involved and how things are going when the negotiations are being made. If a murder is a murder and you don't care about anything else, it's the 20 years. That would be what we're suggesting to be used by a police agency. And then you simply translate the number of years into days.
So what we're talking about there is weighting the crimes, right, so that they're not all counted evenly. I think Scott's demonstration with the reckless endangerments, if you look at agencies and the way that they're usually counted when you talk about hotspots policing, those are 9 separate incidents, whereas the murder is still just one. So the idea is to weight them because it causes more harm for the murder than it does the reckless endangerment, or if you have a prohibited use, that's a misdemeanor, right? You're still picking up shell casings, but it's a misdemeanor. So you have to weight it differently based on the level of crime is what we're saying.
Okay, so why does this matter to you? Again, we're trying to prioritize. especially when it comes to the maps that the crime analysis centers are making. This is a different approach to making the maps to identify the areas to more efficiently place your officers. This is right in the area of hotspots, but rather than counting numbers, we're counting the harm. It's entirely possible that some places that seem to be very dangerous because of the crime count aren't necessarily all that harmful. And you want these to be objective. We cannot emphasize this enough. Okay, we all understand things. I've had conversations with students years in the past where some things are just, they've ramped them up, and other things they don't care about too much. But of course, subjective is not what we're trying to get at here. And again, the idea is it's victim and society centered. How much harm is occurring in this area, in this city, in this beat, on this street? We're trying to figure out a way to be more efficient when it comes to helping victims and reduce crime in certain areas. So what we did, so we took the New York State standards, and we were just looking at gun offenses because we're part of GIVE. We're not concerned with, the crime that pops into my head is vandalism of a cemetery or something like that. It might occur, I'm not belittling it, but we don't care about that one too much. So a Class A violent felony was 20 to 25 years. This is the New York State information. We went with 20, that's why it's underlined. The B, 5 to 25, and again, all this is pretty straightforward. Then you convert it into days. It's the punishment in days is right there. Now, the thing here is that a Class A violent felony could include no jail or probation. And again, we wanted to be fair. We thought to ourselves, if a misdemeanor had been charged, it's entirely possible the same kind of no jail would have been applied. And we're not willing to stand here and say those are the same. We're simply going to say, look, a felony is still a felony, and again, maybe there's a subjective component here. But it makes us say, when the state of New York says, if you're going to be sentenced to jail, it should be, or prison, it should be 1.5 years, we went with 1.5 years, that was the minimum. Again, there's going to be a certain amount of flexibility and give when it comes to developing a crime harm index. Okay, so this is Niagara County, Niagara Crime Analysis Center gave me these are fatal shootings for, you can see the ledger in the corner, 2021, 22, 23, 24. And this is, so I put these together because it's entirely possible that these were occurring like at the end of one year, at the beginning of another, but this is also the hospital, so I wasn't going to ask the Crime Analysis Center to dig too deeply into, was this somebody who was found dead outside because somebody dropped them off. But the point being is that we can all agree, yes, these are hot, but they're far enough apart in dates that I thought, okay, let's just pick this. They occurred the same year. Again, this is just an exercise. This right here is hand-drawn, because again, I'm not a 15-year-old boy. A hand-drawn square with 9 dots representing the shots fired, the reckless endangerments. By any other measure, normally the map tells us that, okay, which one is going to be the, no. There we go. The map would tell us this is the hotspot for the city of Niagara Falls, and it actually was at one point. Those are totally drawn in there by me. But the point here is that if you only had the resources in Niagara Falls for 1 patrol per shift of hotspots of 15 minutes, they would be sent there. The problem is this area over here, like 1.5 blocks away, that would be more harmful. The hotspot patrol should be focused on this, but 9, my math isn't great, 9 is bigger than 2. That's where the hotspot patrols would be. Oh, just out of curiosity, I want to mention this one here. This shot, this killing here, Niagara Falls. If I remember, Larry, that was where the guy got shot a couple of times and then he was stabbed. And the medical examiner said the actual stabbing was what killed the guy. So they're not counting that one. Again, Niagara Falls example, reckless endangerment. If you did the math, real simple, the simple math based upon what we give it. 9 times the 730 days, that's that much days of harm, versus the 2 murders in that other neighborhood, 14,000 days of harm. Again, more harm based upon the level of the offense that was occurring in that area. We're suggesting that's where the hotspot patrols would probably be. Now, again, I did this with just gun crimes. I asked them to give me the crimes for 2002. and I was sitting at the computer, I was playing with the numbers, and basically the total crime count was 840 crimes, gun crimes, in the city of Niagara Falls for that year. That includes all gun crimes that we care about. And then this year there was a little less, which was a 13% reduction in the count, change from the prior year in the total count. And then this year there was a little less, which was a total of 15% reduction. That ain't not bad. If you're the chief of police, you're looking at this and you're saying 15% reduction, the chief's going to be all over this one. Okay. But that's just count. What I also did was I attached, okay, what was the harm of all those crimes? And yes, it did take that much time. In 2002, there was 388,000 days of harm. In 2003, a little less. That was a 25% reduction. 24, somewhat less, for a total of 32% reduction in the amount of days of harm. So again, you're seeing a difference here. One's as good as the other for any kind of chief of police. Yes, we had a reduction. But it demonstrates that there was a lot of reduction in the amount of harm in the city of Niagara Falls. Now again, moving on to the city of Buffalo. Again, there's a square, and I asked the Erie County Crime Analysis Center to provide these maps that I'm about to show you. That part of North Buffalo is on the edge of the village of Kenmore. And if you're not familiar with Buffalo, there's Fort Erie and there's the river, and that's Canada. So you take that square and you make it this. So you can see these areas. These are 500 by 500 blocks that the city of Buffalo has done. I think Syracuse and a few of the others use the same measure. So this tells us that these areas, just looking at it this way, some places were more harmful than others. Good images are very helpful for demonstrating impact on things. So what I asked the Crime Analysis Center to do is give me towers. Give me measures based upon the numbers. So the first one is, from a three-dimensional perspective, you can see this here. You got the 15 down here, and we're just going to focus on this T. We're not going to worry about any of the other numbers. That tells you how much count was. So again, here we go. So strictly speaking, 500 by 500. If this were the hotspot right here, most of your police patrols, hotspot patrols, would be in that area. You probably wouldn't bother in these areas over here too much. But when you look at it from a three-dimensional view based upon harm rather than just counts, you get this. It's a lot higher in that place that only had 2. Now, somebody could say, make the argument, and I would have a little argument for this, is that, well, you could place 1 cop or 2 cops in that 2 in the middle, and the visual of this would be the hotspot patrol for that larger area. All right, fine. I'll live with that. So here's what I did. Now, this is South Buffalo. If you know Buffalo at all, I'm sorry, this is the east side of Buffalo, not South Buffalo. So it's hard to see a little bit. I wish we could dampen the lights. This hotspot area had 11. This hotspot had 9. If you had 1 patrol in the city of Buffalo, you had limited resources, you'd put them where the higher count was, because that's where the higher numbers are. But if you take the harm that was occurring in those 2 areas, this is the difference. It's hugely different harm-wise. Now, just for the hell of it, if you're familiar with Western New York, that's the Niagara River, Grand Island, that's Lake Ontario, that's the CN Tower in Toronto. I plugged that in myself just for the hell of it. I mean, it's not the scale, obviously. But the point here is that if you're looking at this to put your hotspot patrols, the 11 is more than 9. But if you're looking at this for your hotspot patrol, if you're going to be going after harm, you could have a much larger impact on reducing harm in the hotspot with the taller numbers, with the taller tower. Then what I did was I took the numbers that Buffalo was able to give me. These are the give-related crimes, again, firearm kinds of crimes. For a couple-year period, there were 13,559 give crimes. And I analyzed these in a different way. I just wanted to see if the trend over time was up or down. So first thing I did, obviously, is I went after the count. How many in the count? That was a count. So was there a reduction in the counts each month? And again, I know nobody's really interested in this, so I'll go zip through this really quickly. But basically, month to month, there was a reduction of, with a negative, a reduction of not even half a count per month. This is not statistically significant, right over here, which tells us this reduction could have happened by chance. So, because most people don't like tables, they like graphs. So I graphed it out. So the solid line is the linear, don't worry about the quadratic equation, the linear. Now, that's barely a bunny hill on a ski slope. But, again, if a chief of police was having a reduction in the crime count over time, would that chief shout it from the rooftops? Yeah. They would be happy with this. We've got a reduction in the number of crimes that are occurring. Fine, that's okay, that's good. Here's what I did when I looked at harm. There was a statistically significant reduction in harm over time, month to month. Again, nobody cares about numbers too much. A few of us nerds maybe, but you'd rather look at the graph. Here's your graph. Chief of police is going to be definitely taking this one to the newspaper, television. They're going to promote this one all over the place because the harm is much greater reduction in harm over time. This was for the city of Buffalo for just a 3-year period of time. Somebody else.
Couple of things to think about before I even get into this that I wanted to kind of piggyback off of what Scott had been saying. So there's a couple of different reasons why I think this has value that I think you guys should consider. He talked about a couple of different ways in which you can change the perspective of exactly how much progress you're having, but this can be worked on a couple of different angles. It's important that it can point out both success you may be having and emphasize it more, but it can also do the opposite. Right? So I'll give you 2 examples of what this can do for you. Last year, we actually had a presentation from a police department in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, who used the crime harm index in their jurisdiction. And one of the most interesting findings they had when they used the crime harm index was that despite the fact that over the course of the entire testing period of using this, their calls for service stayed exactly the same, they saw a significant reduction in harm. So if they had just simply looked at both at call volume, they would have felt like perhaps they were not having any level of impact on what their crime problem was in their jurisdiction. But when looking at it as far as how much they were actually driving down harm, they had actually made a significant impact with the work that they were doing because they had started a hotspots campaign at the same time, and then we're trying to calculate what kind of impact that hotspots was doing. Another jurisdiction that I will not name specifically because this is not good for them, was touting a significant reduction in both the amount of calls for service and the total amount of crime that occurred in their jurisdiction based on count. But if you evaluated those exact same numbers based on harm, it looked like it was completely flat, or maybe it had actually risen a little bit because they had actually driven down were perhaps the least harmful crimes in that particular jurisdiction. So maybe they had made a concerted effort to bring down, not that, there isn't some level of importance attached to, bringing down like a larceny or something that's happening in a mall or anything like that, but touting a 20 or 30 or 40% decrease in crime when that crime is largely not perhaps the crime that we think of when we think of harm and victimization to a community does make a difference, right? And so if we're trying to highlight what makes the most sense or what has the most value to your department or what you really want to be targeting most, you want to make sure you have not necessarily just one perspective, but definitely both. And one of the other things that I wanted to talk about as far as transparency, which we already kind of alluded to, is we've already kind of mentioned the idea that hotspots can sort of be self-generated, right? You can go into a spot, enforce that spot a lot, and if all of that gets counted the same way any other call for service that comes into an agency gets counted, then you end up kind of creating this cyclical pattern where you go, oh, this spot is hot, but was it hot because you made it hot, or was it hot because calls were coming in because people needed help over there, right? Those are 2 very different things. One of the best things about this is, as part of GIVE, we talk a lot about transparency and going to the community and kind of telling them what a police department is doing and why they're doing it. And one of the things the Crime Harm Index provides to you as a tool is the ability to tell people in a community that you are looking at this from this lens. And it's not a subjective lens, it's not a policing lens, it's a victimization lens. You're saying that you are calling us, and this is where you're being harmed, and this is why we're going there, right? It's one of the best ways to justify police action in a location because it is a wholly objective minimum sentencing perspective of police calls for service coming from victims themselves, as opposed to police-initiated stops, police-initiated actions, or just general aggregated crime numbers, ad nauseum. So the idea here is that it can actually create and build trust because you're talking about the kinds of victimization that they attach the most amount of value to. So
I'll add one other
Yeah, go ahead.
one other thing there in regards to when you're talking about taking a look at including like a harm index. And maybe in conjunction with what you're already using with hotspots. A lot of times, especially from the DCJS angle, we're looking at it from guns or gun violence or something like that. Now, that doesn't preclude agencies from looking at this from their own jurisdictional priorities, right? There's a lot of different ways that you can prioritize stuff, and chiefs, commissioners, they have pressure from offices, public offices, the community, in different ways to look at stuff. So, they may have their own priority, and there's different ways to, I guess, combat that as well too, like creating like a larceny hotspots if that's an issue with your jurisdiction. Maybe you don't have as much violence. So there's different ways to do it. So I guess just to mention real quick that what we're talking about here doesn't say, we're not saying that your jurisdictions have to do this or that you really need to do this. I mean, it's something that most would hold, I guess, as a pretty big priority when we talk about serious crimes, but it's just a different way for jurisdictions to take a look at those serious crimes. So they're not just counting dots or they're not just counting crimes, but they're actually tallying up the seriousness of those crimes that are occurring in their jurisdiction.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, no, I think it's a great point because the reality is that, as we mentioned early in the beginning of the presentation about how this could be done for either a large or a small agency, is yes, you absolutely don't need to focus on we're GIV, so we're looking at gun crime. But the reality is the best thing about this is that you can attach a harm value to, virtually anything with a minimum sentence. And it takes a lot of the what is the subjective nature of things out of the equation. And it presents just a different light of how you can perhaps see exactly what's occurring in your community. There are some things you are supposed to leave out of a crime harm index. We already talked about police initiated things. There's obviously historical crime you want to leave out, which means like things that get reported to you that didn't happen that year. And all of those are important to kind of make sure that as you are working your way through this, you are not measuring those. We'll talk about one other one that we suggest you leave out as well. But one of the things that's important if you want to initiate something like this is that the New York State obviously has a crime analysis center network, and if you were interested in potentially putting something like this together, because Scott has initiated this conversation with a couple of places, we do now have a working way to do this in a couple of jurisdictions, and some people who can then liaise with other analysts about how they might want to potentially build this up for your organization and potentially tailor it to the problems that are occurring in your jurisdiction, whether you're a jurisdiction that has an aggravated assault issue, as Brian mentioned, if you're a jurisdiction that has a larceny issue, or you are a jurisdiction that is suffering from violent crime and want to target it from a different lens. If you are interested in doing that, you're in a GIV jurisdiction, you can talk to a field advisor. Even if you are not a GIV police department, you can always come to a regional field advisor, and those individuals can still help you with connecting you with resources. We do it all the time because we put a focused effort on GIV jurisdictions because of the GIV program does not mean that we are not interested in providing technical assistance and support to anyone in any county if they're interested in leveraging something like this. This sort of wrap up on this particular slide is just the idea that it can be used for a lot of different things. It can support your planning because a lot of people are resource poor and need to be able to optimize those resources. It can help you with prioritizing cases. It can help you with your overall strategy alignment. So if you're going to implement something like hotspots, you can be able to do that in either a more robust way, a slightly different way, or at least a way that you hadn't been thinking about in the past. Obviously, considerations need to be made. You can't simply look at one murder on a chart and then decide that that spot is hot. Like, you should be looking at these kinds of trends over time so that they make sense to you. But the idea is that if you look and calibrate and count harm in a way like this, you can actually start noticing trends and patterns that you never would have seen or identified through the traditional counting lens.
Yeah, can I just say one other thing, Ryan? I think it is just a different lens to take a look at harm within your jurisdictions, and it's something that after you have the opportunity to see where that harm may exist, there is a humanistic factor in this, and I don't want to overlook that in the sense that you really do need to kind of dig into the areas that harm is occurring a little bit more and see what is causing. What were the jobs? What exactly were those occurrences, and how's the response going to look? It's almost a problem-oriented policing or SARA approach, but that needs to occur too from a humanistic level, because you probably won't be able to just put cops into an area just based off of the harm alone. You kind of have to understand what's going on in there. So I don't want to overlook that humanistic side of it as well. That still has to be completed as part of the process.
Few points we want to make that, again, get into the complexity and the nuance of a crime harm index. Again, don't want to overemphasize this too much, but we want to avoid the kinds of harms that are being generated by police-initiated activity. There are certain limitations that the crime harm index we're having problems working our way through this one. The officer reports, numbers can be influenced on how they do things, whether they're initiating these things or not themselves. And reports may change later in time, so you might arrest somebody initially and charge them with something. That would probably be the first thing. And then down the line, a week or two later, and the DA gets the case, they might charge, increase, decrease, drop it. It's hard to say. It's hard to keep track of all that information. So we're not going to sweat that one too much for this conversation, other than to just let you know that there can be a little bit more nuanced aspects of this. A couple of other things to consider. A single criminal incident. The top shooting in Buffalo had 10 people who died, and 3 were injured. I don't know what the charge would have been for those. But the simple fact of the matter is that this was not a crime harm location before. This tops on Jefferson Avenue. Suddenly, this is considered to be an outlier in our respects. This is something that was extremely unusual. I don't want to compare this to the same things, but it's almost like you don't count officer-involved deaths during the course of the year for September for 2001, because so many officers beyond firemen died that day. It's just unusual that you wouldn't include them, because suddenly this would be something that would be a harm spot where you put patrol officers, and it would be silly to do that. Because what we say is this undermines the crime harm score's purpose. You're trying to identify places with persistent harm. This came out of the blue, and trust me, living in Western New York, this definitely did. Now, multiple harms. This is something Sarah and I have discussed, via email. And this is the debate part. A shooting with injury. So you can have the shooting with injury, which could be the reckless endangerment, and the CWP, which is criminal possession of a weapon, make it seem like more serious than it is. We're suggesting that you only pick the highest level charge in this. And this assumes somebody was shot and there was an arrest and you caught the guy with the gun, so you had the gun, allowing you the CWP charge to be on there. And then there also with the shooting with the injury here, again, assault second is a D felony according to the state of New York, which is 730 days. This, again, the assault seems to be viscerally more important than the criminal possession of a weapon, which is a C felony. So this is the kind of stuff you have to work through and try to stay objective on. Okay, which is more harmful? Well, according to the state of New York's legislation, it's the C felony that's more harmful. Even if at the gut level, the shooting with an injury, which would be the assault charge, would just seem worse. We only use gun crimes. Again, I'm not going to echo this too much. There are other places, smaller jurisdictions don't have a lot of gun crimes. They've got a variety of other kinds of crimes. This can be tailored to your own kind of agency. We also threw in this slide just for the demonstration of New York State Penal Code. A violent felony, B has a violent and a non-violent felony. These are the kinds of things you'd have to work out. This is the kind of, like I said earlier, the decision to have an E felony, even though it said minimum sentence would be like probation, we just weren't comfortable with having like nothing as a punishment for an E felony where it might be the equivalent of a misdemeanor. So we decided that, well, the basic punishment of a year and a half, that's what we're going to go with. But again, this is just demonstrating the complexity of how to work through what do you want, what do you not want in your crime harm index. So what's in it for you? Again, jurisdictions can use this in different ways, smaller, larger. This can be a different approach to counting, scratch that, I don't want to use the word, to measuring the problem of crime in your jurisdiction. And again, certain agencies are going to be smaller. You're going to have certain considerations that as give agencies, we don't really focus on too much. But this could be a good thing for your police agencies, for your mayor, or city council, or whatever the political arm is. This supports the victim-centered idea. That's what we're trying to do here. Not just count the crimes in these areas, count the amount of harm. And some people would suggest this is more procedurally just, which is a big component of what GIV's all about. We're trying to get procedural justice out there as well. This, again, seems to be something that just makes a little bit more sense at the gut level, that this is a better approach to measuring what the problems are. And again, police agencies, I've talked to a few different people about hiring and retention, and different agencies are going to have different considerations. If you have a smaller agency, you don't have a lot of patrol officers on the job at a certain period of time. Maybe I know in the summertime, some agencies have larger numbers than in the off season. So you can be more efficient with the officers when you ask them to spend 12 to 15 minutes in an area. We're suggesting it's an area that's more harmful. That's probably the better approach here. We admit, this is an imperfect tool. Getting anybody to change their mind on, we've always done it this way. This gets back to that kind of comment. We've always done it this way. That's fine. I don't disagree with you've always done it that way. Maybe this is a better approach to doing it. And I throw in the parenthetic, the perfect cannot become the enemy of the good. It might not be perfect, but if it's better, we're suggesting that this is something you can give a try to.
Now, I guess we would suggest just take a look at it. Have your agencies draw up the stats on it and just take a look. How does that harm align with where your hotspots currently are? And what's the difference between the two?
Any questions? How much time do we have? Slane.
I guess I'm struggling with understanding how the feeling of society and particular community comes into play. And I think that's why I said, in terms of harm to the community, non-residential threat or treaty is going to have a
can start. No, those are all, every single question you asked is excellent and just speaks to some additional things that we should be answering. Number one is the example, for example, that you gave of domestic violent homicide. That's not something that would be counted in this tool. So I should start with this. The goal of this is to improve what the police are doing to reduce violent crime that is occurring, that their presence can reduce, right? So domestic violent homicide is happening inside, right, of a home, right? The idea of creating better hotspot maps, like you're not going to create hotspot maps for a crime that you would have been able to prevent, right? Like the idea of Cooper curve stops or police patrol presence in hotspot locations is to create a deterrent effect for what's happening outside in a geographical location. So when we're looking at harm from this particular lens, the idea is to be looking at crime that is occurring in the public space, in the public sphere. And you make another really good point about how the community may feel about something like this. And it's a conversation we actually recently had with our Office of Justice Research and Performance about the community's perspective and lens on this. And I think it's important to talk about the crime harm index as the idea that it is a policing tool, right? So the goal is for the police to be in the places where they're going to be mitigating the most amount of harm that they can see and intervene and stop, right? So when we're identifying locations here or trying to identify locations where harm is occurring, it's not so much being cognizant of how the community sentiment may be, because you're right, it may resonate differently in those areas of frequency that you're talking about, but it's more so where the police need to be to reduce the worst possible scenarios that may be occurring in those particular persistent spots. But I'll let Brian.
Yeah, I'll just
piggyback on
add
that.
just a couple other comments to that. I mean, the natural question is why is this a harm spot, right? And I think that's very important. And I mentioned it briefly as Scott was going through the presentation, but you have to ask the why. Why is this a harm spot? Is it those two homicides that really have no relation to anything else that's going on in that area? Because maybe you don't need to focus your resources in that area if that's the case. And that's why agencies do have to take that problem-oriented approach to the harm spots to understand exactly what is going on there and then come up with some kind of logical response to that. If it's a long-term harm spot, what is causing that? Is it a certain apartment complex? Can you deal with the individual that owns that apartment complex that's allowing drugs to be sold outside and violence to occur? So you do have to take that follow-up step to try to understand it. And then from a community perspective, there's always going to be some differences, I think, that exist. Like, you know, as in my career, we've had several incidents where maybe somebody fired a gun at a location, 20, 30 some rounds, went into a house, and now you have 2- and 3-year-olds in there that are victims. Terrible, terrible crimes, right? Naturally, that's going to gain a lot more attention, and a precinct commander may want to put more time and resources into specific crimes like that, so it doesn't preclude them from still doing that if there's those types of cases that really do need the additional resources. But again, it's a humanistic factor that you do have to look at this stuff outside of just the maps. I mean, I think the map's consistent no matter what. I mean, everything that's harm stays on the map, but it is digging into those specific areas and trying to figure out what is causing it. Because it might be a couple different factors. We see that in micro hotspots or hotspots in general, right? Where you have actual 2 or 3 things going on, locations, people, they're actually causing that area to be hot. So, again, it is kind of digging into that, but that might be telling patrol officers, look, we don't have enough information on this area. What is going on from your perspective? Going out and talking to the community, listen, we have several incidents out here. What do you see going on? What is the problem in your community so that we can address it?
Yeah, I have a couple of things also. I hate to keep giving her, we have 5 minutes. We're not trying to diminish it, but it's the idea of if it's domestic, that yes, this is something that the random patrols for the hotspots probably wouldn't deal with. And you said something else a moment ago, and now it's escaping me, so I have to apologize. I can't remember what that was. No, never mind. So,
You know, I love the idea of moving beyond raw numbers and just the traditional crime stats because they've like hamstrung us in so many ways. But when I said it depends before, it was really about like harm to whom and what type of harm. Because to only look at the proximate victim of the harm is to fail to my mind anyway, acknowledge like the genuine harms that non-proximate victims feel when crime happens, and also they're not simply like bodily injury harms. And I think, you know, so I like the idea of what's going to be like an algorithm, but I think the manner of weighting is really important. I think if people are afraid, for example, to go outside because of 10 shootings, that is extremely harmful to the community. That's the type of lack of resilience in the community that causes a terrible spiral. Whereas I can think of scenarios where one dead person, like as tragic as that is, and you go and you arrest the people who did that and break up that cycle of violence, that could be less harmful than other incidents that are non-fatal, for example. And I worry the chiefs of police will get the algorithm, and I think to say sentiment doesn't fully acknowledge what I'm getting at when this is not about sentiment. Well, it is about harm. Like if you don't open a business because I was going to invest my life savings in this store fund, but there were 2 shootings outside in the last month. They didn't hit anyone. One of them just hit a store window. That is a harm, right? And I'd love to see an algorithm. Maybe you can't do it, that like really gets to that. So you look at what Royals are, something like disorder in New York City is all that's on folks' mind these days, and that doesn't even like, and that drives police resource allocation. It doesn't show up.
I'm going to really nerd out here. In the 60s, Marvin Wolfgang did a study. He interviewed people and asked them basically, okay, how much harm do you think is a theft worth, those kinds of things. Now, it's entirely possible to do that. You could go to the city of Niagara Falls or the city of Buffalo or fill in a city and get a survey of thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people and see, and then do the math that way and develop the harm index based upon that. Again, that's not going to be inexpensive. We're seeing the imperfections of this, but those are the kinds of things that would be an alternative, but not an easy option.
Or even like create a good algorithm, but allow the inputs, have the agility to situationally change the weights as needed, not just so it's not written in stone. I know that
No.
might not be.
No, it's an excellent point. It's something that we actually, again, I don't want to keep bringing OJRP into the conversation, but it's something that they raised, and it's something that we want to inquire about. So you're on the money that there are things that we think that we could expand upon, that this is a starting point. This is not an ending point for taking a different perspective on this, but creating a holistic lens that brings in more into that algorithm is not off the table whatsoever.
It's better than raw numbers.
Right.
You had a question?
I had a question, although in comments to that, I just wanted to say, in defense of algorithms and stats, there are a lot of the difference between the public perception and stats and we stuff, so I don't know how much you really want to have that included in the heat map.
Okay.
But the question I was going to ask is, and I apologize, I may have missed this, you might have said something about it, but you're trying to keep this subjective, you're trying to avoid subjectivity, and you're going with the minimum sentences for each of the different felony
Right.
classes. Is there, other than the fact that it doesn't work, is there any reason why you chose legal codes to base that on as opposed to doing it empirically, take a big sample of convictions, see what the average sentence is for Class C felonies? That would get around the, well, some.
Yeah, no, yeah, no, it's great. It really, I mean, it's something that we have been debating quite a bit, because I'm more of a believer that, at least in the United States, truth in sentencing may be a better way to take a look at that, to take a sampling of something like that, at overall sentences, what the end result is, opposed to minimum sentencing, just because of the way that it's done. And quite honestly, I think that some e-felonies aren't quite created equally, even though they're on the books. We also know judges sentence e-felonies differently, depending on, obviously, aggravating and mitigating circumstances, but the actual crime itself sometimes. So it's something that we've talked about quite a bit, and we might try to do.
Yeah, and it's an excellent point, because one of the things that we've talked about, once again, with our lovely people from OGRP, is the idea that the biggest problem with that is how much the disparity there is region to region. So there's a conversation about maybe doing that regionally, because a desk appearance ticket in New York City could be multiple years somewhere else in the state. So like the question is, how do we hone it in where we can find where there's a reasonable and agreeable middle ground? Like, there's a lot of nuance to that in an ongoing conversation we can absolutely have. But there was one more question in the back that I wanted to make sure I got to.
My thought process, you brought up the top shooting, you brought up the shootings, the 9 shootings, no effect, and then the murder. You said during the top shooting, you said you don't know if the 3 who survived, what those charges would have been for
Correct,
that
yeah.
person, because the weight of the 10 deaths far outweighed that. And you make the point of, in one region, it may be weighted one way, but the collaboration or the calibration of the charges for the crime and that the punishment fit the crime makes a stark difference too. The community does make a difference because they're the ones that are truly affected or held hostage by the situation. But her stance is in asking the question of why is the non-shootings more than the murder? You know, I get it if you say, okay, every time he shot the gun, that no one was hurt, but if he had been caught or arrested with the gun, that would have been a 2-year charge or what have you, and so that adds up more than just the 1 shooting, so it only gets to 25 years. Is that what you're saying? Maybe I'm confused, and maybe I'm playing in your room that I don't need to know. I go back to France. But it was just a lot of information here, but there's a lot of conversation around before it becomes because the community will be the ones that will be on you about you're not taking care of me as my family, you're not taking care of me as the victim, you know.
Yeah.
This person still live, I lost my loved one. Those
Yeah, it's a great point, and like I'm going to try to recap super fast my thoughts on it. The way I look at this is that the thought of everything you said is totally welcome in this conversation. The whole point of bringing this up is we didn't bring this up and said this is what you should do to replace what you're doing. We brought this up to say, hey, have you looked at everything you could be looking at? Right? And is this another perspective that perhaps you have not taken? That does not mean it necessarily needs to replace what you've already done. It certainly doesn't mean that you should be replacing the context that Brian has mentioned multiple times about working that problem, understanding what's actually happening, and then making a choice that is not necessarily in alignment with what that map necessarily says. That map isn't the do-all, end-all, but it does provide an opportunity to look at something that perhaps you had not seen before.
Okay, and the last thing I want to say about that is that, so with the gun give mile, I'm going to say first about that.
Yeah.
But the gun give mile versus the top shooting piece, although a gun was involved, I think they were 2 different things.
Correct.
And so they need to be judged separately. I don't think.
Yes, that was our.
Together.
Correct. That was actually the goal of that slide, was to say that it should not even be included. It should be thought of and viewed completely differently.
30 seconds. The city of Niagara Falls does not include the factory outlet mall. That's in the town of Niagara. If you brought into the city of Niagara Falls, the factory outlet mall, the thefts are through the roof. That is one big blue dot in that area. So that would be getting all the attention, all of the thefts. It would outshine the shootings. It would outshine the pops in the air. So that's kind of the point of this, is that there's a lot of thinking that goes on beyond the idea of just changing into something new, which is always a beast to do. The idea of what goes into this takes a lot of effort to kick around. Last question. I saw your hand. I saw.
Okay, so just a couple of things as well. My first question is gun violence, with that murder, say that we have that picture, was that an isolated incident, and was that the intended person to be killed?
Again, you're pretty.
Hypothetically, if we go back to that, I just
wanna talk?
wanted to say that because I feel like when we say domestic violence and you're mentioning it's because it's isolated, it's inside, but it's not, because a lot of times we're finding that there might be that threat to an entire health center, because maybe that person is waiting outside for the person to get back out, and they may very well go inside with a weapon, and there are staff there, so it is a community-related situation. So I wonder if this could potentially have an adverse impact on intimate partner gender-based violence within the situation, because there are multiple calls often where law enforcement is requested, but because of certain situations that are outside that scope, they may not respond as they would to a call that there may be gun violence happening outside of the home. So I'm just wondering, is that ever something that's included on this, if it is death by gun?
Not for this. And the reason why I say that is because we have Strive in New York State, and the way we are providing evidence-based information for how people should be mitigating domestic violence is really a completely different vantage point of how they should be evaluating lethality indicators, how they should be making the stops, the kinds of questions they should be doing, and the kind of ways they should be identifying the problems and the people that they should be targeting, and the offenders who may be the type of person that you were talking about. When we talk about the crime harm index and the type of hotspots patrol, police preventative deterrence patrols that occur in association with that's more of a gun violence strategy versus an intimate partner violence strategy, which really has its own set of parameters, which we talk to law enforcement about as a completely different thing. So we don't really ask them to conflate those things together because we don't want those to be lost in the mix. Is sort of my one thought on that, and I know Brian had another thing you wanted to say.
No, I just wanted to mention too that this is not the only harm index. We're talking about this in the scope of harm and violent crime, but there's also indexes that could be created, harm indexes for suspects, DV suspects, as well as victims as well too, to figure out who is being harmed the most based on the level of violence that they're seeing. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this, but for the purposes of what we were talking about today, it really just does more focus so on the gun and violent type crimes. And I'll just make one last comment, and then we'll be done for the day. But I think with a lot of this stuff too, it doesn't diminish the other type of crimes that occur out there. Again, because it's just focused on the violence. It's not saying don't pay attention to the other stuff that's going on. This is what's important to you. No, every jurisdiction should have a way to prioritize different types of crimes and different type of situations, even cases, right? Like I would still, even if a crime occurs, like a violent crime occurs to somebody outside of a harm area, so to speak, I would still expect my detectives to approach that case with just as much zeal as they would any other case.